Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel, Inain's Forensic Classroom. So today we are going to learn the final topic of our crime scene investigation, which is crime scene reconstruction. Now, over the last few videos, we have learned a lot, but after all of that, one important question still remains, which is what actually happened? Because at the end of the day, a fingerprint is just a fingerprint, a bloodstain is just a bloodstain. Each piece of evidence tells us something, but only a little part of a story. The real challenge is taking hundreds of separate observations, photographs, measurements, laboratory findings, and turning them into a logical sequence of events that explain what happened, how it happened, and sometimes even why it happened. And that process is what we call as crime scene reconstruction. It is where everything we have learned throughout the series comes together. Now, it is where the investigators use the evidence to move beyond simply collecting the clues and begin understanding the events that took place at the crime scene. Now, if I have to give you a proper definition, it would be this. Crime scene reconstruction is the scientific process of determining the sequence of events that occurred before, during, and after a crime by analyzing the physical evidence, witness information, scene documentation, and laboratory findings. Now, before we get into the principles and stages of reconstruction, let's first understand what reconstruction actually is. Now, a lot of students think crime scene reconstruction is just another name for investigation, but investigation is the entire process of solving a case, right? But reconstruction is only a part of it. It's a part of this entire investigative process. Its job is to take all the available information and determine the sequence of events that most likely occurred. And reconstruction is not based on guesswork, it's based on science, it's based on logic and evidence. Now, investigators use the crime scene observations, laboratory findings, and their understanding of how different types of crimes typically occur. Every conclusion must be supported by evidence. If the evidence doesn't support it, it doesn't belong in the reconstruction. Another important thing that you have to remember is reconstruction cannot rely on witness statements alone. Now, witnesses can forget details, they can misunderstand what they saw, or remember events differently over time. That is why physical evidences play such a critical role. For example, blood stains, fingerprints, digital evidences, and injury patterns. These help investigators determine whether a proposed sequence of events actually fits the fact. And finally, reconstruction is rarely a one-person job. Crime scene investigators, forensic pathologists, ballistic experts, toxicologists, all contribute information. Each expert provide a different piece of information, and reconstruction bring those pieces together into one evidence-based explanation of what most likely occurred. Now let's talk about the principles of crime scene reconstruction. Now, before we start reconstructing any crime scene, there are few important principles that guide the entire process. These principles are what make the reconstruction scientific, reliable, and defensible in the court. The first one is the locals exchange principle, which you have probably heard many times throughout this series, which is every contact leaves a trace. Now, whenever a person enters a crime scene, they leave something behind and they take something away. Now, in many ways, reconstruction is possible because of this principle. Without physical traces, there would be nothing to reconstruct. Then another important concept is looking at evidence both individually and collectively, right? Now, in forensic science, we call it as intra-analysis and inter-analysis. Now, intra-analysis means studying a single piece of evidence on its own and asking, what can this tell me, right? For example, if you examine a blood stain and you study its shape, its direction, its size, and pattern, that means you are performing intra-analysis. But reconstruction doesn't stop there. Investigators also perform inter-analysis, which means you are looking at how different pieces of evidences relate to one another. Now, instead of looking only at blood stain, you compare it with the position of body, you compare it with the broken glass or the shoe impression and any other evidence which is present at the crime scene. Now, think of it this way. Intra-analysis asks, what does this piece of evidence tell me, right? Now, while inter-analysis asks, how does this piece of evidence connect with all the others? Now, reconstruction requires both. You first understand each piece individually, and then you understand how they fit together to explain what happened. Another principle that can never be ignored is objectivity. Now, investigators must follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it challenges their initial assumptions. Now, the goal is not to prove a theory, the goal is to discover the truth. The moment someone starts forcing the evidence to fit into a conclusion, the reconstruction loses its scientific value. We also rely on corroboration, which simply means that no conclusion should be based on the single piece of evidence. A fingerprint may suggest one thing, but when that fingerprint is supported by DNA, bloodstain pattern, and witness information, the conclusion becomes much stronger. Now, the more independent pieces of evidence that point in the same direction, the more confidence investigators can have in their reconstruction. And finally, crime scene reconstruction follows a scientific method. Investigators observe the evidence, they develop possible explanation, they test those explanation against the facts, and then they arrive at a conclusion which is supported by the evidence. That is what separates reconstruction from the guesswork. Now let's talk about the actual process of crime scene reconstruction. Now the process is usually divided into 5 stages. The first one is the data collection. This is where investigators gather each piece of information which is related to the case. Crime scene photos, videos, sketches, laboratory reports, all of it, everything is collected and organized. And honestly, this stage is one of the most important because reconstruction can only be as good as the information available. If important evidence is missed or documented poorly, it can affect everything that comes later. Now, once all the information has been collected, investigators move to the second stage, which is called as conjecture. Now, a conjecture is simply an initial idea of what may have happened. It's not a conclusion and it is definitely not a proof. It is just a starting point based on the first review of the available information. Experienced investigators often develop these early impressions very quickly, but they must always be willing to change them if new evidence points in a different direction. Now, the third stage is hypothesis formulation. This is where things become more scientific. A hypothesis is a detailed and testable explanation of events. Investigators examine the evidence carefully and they begin asking questions like, where did the attack happen? How did the offender enter and leave? What sequence of events best explain the evidence? Now, the answer helps build a hypothesis that can be tested. The fourth stage is testing. This is where the investigators check whether their hypothesis actually matches the evidence, like DNA results, bloodstain patterns, digital records, laboratory finding. All of this is examined, and this is something I really want you to remember. The goal is not to prove the hypothesis right. The goal is to see whether it survives the testing. If the evidence contradicts it, the hypothesis must be changed. That is how science works. And the fifth stage is theory formation, which is the last stage. Now, after repeating testing and careful analysis, investigators arrive at the explanation that is best supported by the available evidence. Now, in science, a theory is not a guess. It is the explanation that is best supported by the evidence itself. In science, this becomes the final reconstruction of what most likely happened at the crime scene. Now let's talk about the limitations of crime scene reconstruction. Now, before we finish, there's one last thing I want you to remember. Crime scene reconstruction is incredibly powerful, but it's not perfect. And that's important to understand. A reconstruction is only as good as the evidence available. If evidence was destroyed, contaminated, missed during the search, or never existed in the first place, there will always be gaps in the reconstruction. Witness information can also create challenges. People can forget details, they can remember events differently, or they may be influenced by the conversations, media reports, or suggestions from others. And perhaps most importantly, reconstruction is based on the evidence which is available at that particular moment. If new evidence is discovered later, the reconstruction may need to be revised. That's not a weakness of forensic science, it's actually one of its greatest strength. Science is willing to change when new evidence appears. And with that, we have come to the end of our crime scene investigation series. If you have followed this entire journey, you now understand something more many people never realize. Forensic investigation is about patience, it's about observation, critical thinking, and attention to detail. Every little detail matters. And honestly, we have spent a lot of time together throughout this series, and I truly hope these videos have helped make forensic science easier to understand and a little more enjoyable to learn. So, if this series has helped you in any way, whether for your exams, your classes, or simply because you're curious about forensic science, then please hit the like button. It really helps these videos reach more students who need them. And if you have watched this far and still haven't subscribed, go ahead and subscribe and become a part of our growing forensic science community. And most importantly, share this series with anyone who thinks forensic science is all about memorizing definitions. Let's help more students understand this subject instead of just learning it for your exams. Thank you for being part of this journey. I'll see you in the next series. Till then, take care. Bye bye.